And we're now live.
We're now live. Okay, so I, Oliver Brackenbury, I'm here with Gemma Files. Hello, Gemma. Thanks for joining
Hey,
us today.
thanks for asking me. I'm always happy to talk.
No, that's true. I remember from when we spoke about haunted houses on the Worlds of the Mirror collection, and as a talker from a family of talkers,
Mhm.
I respect it and I love it. And I have this open in another tab, which I'm hearing echoing my voice. So I'm going to close that tab because I'm a
Okay, yeah,
professional.
it's a good idea.
Jesus Christ. Sorry, folks. This is only my second live stream. I'm still figuring out the nitty gritty of it. But I believe it involves talking and you guys hearing, and you guys also being able to ask questions in the comments if you want to do that. We've got our, engineer, host, mega dude Kevin is managing that side of things, and when there's an appropriate gap, he'll throw the questions up on the screen so we can all see them, and Jem and I will see what we can do to address them. But
Okay.
what is our topic today, Oliver? Well, Oliver, I thought since it is the 100th anniversary of Weird Tales magazine, the magazine in which Sword Sorcery was born, and born with huge overlap with horror and actually sci-fi and suspense and other genres, but I always think of horror as kind of the main sibling of the fantasy elements in that lovely subgenre, which I've got a whole magazine going on about, which by the way, there's a Kickstarter in case you guys somehow are aware of this live stream and not aware there's a Kickstarter. We're almost at 75%, so get on in there, throw your money at us. You'll get a cool magazine in return. But yes, given it's the 100th anniversary of Weird Tales, and given that Gemma is going to be contributing a story to our table of contents, she's not just somebody I knew. And, if you even just glance at her bibliography, like, she knows horror. I thought it'd be fun for us to chat about these things today. And Gemma, I will open by pointing out I probably would have thought to reach out to you anyway because I love your book Experimental Film. I like your work in general. I really like
Thank you.
chatting with you, which I find is a good indicator that you'll probably be a good person to work with. But also, I was very amused to see on Facebook around the same time I was thinking, I want to get some more horror chops into the magazine. Who am I going to reach out to? And I saw on Facebook you were putting up sketches of characters from House of Dragons.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Oh man, hot D. Yeah, I have a huge love of sword and sorcery, and I've had a huge love of it for pretty much my entire life. And I will point out that the whole weird tales. Yes, the absolutely the overlap is between horror and science fiction and fantasy. But I also think that even just innate within the phrase sword and sorcery, the sorcery involved is rarely, oh, let's make butterflies.
Yeah, or I've got like a +1 wand with 3 charges, and we know the rules for exactly how this works, and there will
Yeah,
be no
exactly.
downsides.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, instead it's usually, oh, I fell down this hole and I found a snake god, and or so, or like the beginning of Kenneth Lee's Companions on the Road, where a huge dark city has just been overthrown and was ruled by a witch king and his 2 children. And and then we fell down a hole and we found this huge gold cup that used to hold blood sacrifices, and pretty soon we were being pursued by ghosts.
Exactly, right? Like
Witch
it's
ghosts.
dark and terrible. There's usually a horrible
Yeah.
cost for those who experiment with it.
Yeah, exactly.
And
That's
I
the
was
way
talking.
I like it. That's the way I like it. Oh, the Colossus of Ilorin, for example, by Clark Ashton Smith. Holy shit! In which in which a necromancer has been killed, executed, and his cult of necromancy students get together
Yes.
and melt down corpses to make a gigantic golem made out of corpse fat, which they then reanimate their dead master inside of, so that he can just
Yeah.
crush all the people who got him killed.
Well, actually, so you mentioned Tanith Lee, you mentioned Clark Ashton Smith.
Yes.
Who was your sort of gateway drug for sword and sorcery, and how young? Were you 10? Was it last week? Like when did you fall down the rabbit
Oh,
hole of sword and sorcery?
I probably fell down the sword and sorcery hole when I was around, yeah, I'd say like 9, 10, 11. And I used to be able to walk up to a um, secondhand bookstore, and I would go up there, and things were a lot cheaper back then, and buy like 5 books for $5, and they would always be. At one point, my dad was like, and it's like, yeah, pick out a bunch of books, pick out whatever you want. When I was visiting him in Australia, and I came back with a bunch of books, and he was like, "Why are these all about sex and violence?" I'm like,
Like, yeah, that's
because
the good
I,
stuff.
I guess you don't know me very well. But yes, all the stuff that I was interested in was pretty much always, it's like, does it have a mainly naked woman covered in gold and jewels on the front? Is there a person with a big sword? Does it look like it has horrible dark magic? Is it sort of like archaeology, but sort of not? So yeah, I would say that, my gateway drug actually was probably Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Oh, okay,
Uh,
cool.
yeah. And so I started off by reading all the Of Mars books,
Hmm.
and like John Carter of Mars,
Good
basically.
old Sword and Planet,
And
yeah.
yeah, and and then I moved on to anything else that had a Rosetta cover on it. Um, Found Tanith Lee, found Michael Moorcock, particularly the Chronicles of Coram.
Mm.
Uh, I found Robert E. Howard, and the people who afterwards were doing like Howard-esque stuff. And yeah, I'd say that all of those people kind of contributed to my love of sword and sorcery. But always, you know, I was always looking for what called to me. And yes, that was sex and that was violence, but it was also things where women were, centered rather than just lying around going, ah, you know.
Well,
And
before we
funnily enough, Howard is actually pretty good for that, because often, Conan will run across some woman and she's not exactly a shrinking violet.
no, Valyria and Red Nails,
Oh my
Bali, the
god,
Pirate
yes.
Queen.
Yeah, I
I always
saw
think of
when she was whipping you. You know?
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I yeah, no, we were just talking about this before we went live,
Yeah,
but you were expressing admiration for Robert E. Howard's Swordwoman stories.
yes. Dark Agnes still a fair. And I remember I came across her before I came across C.L. Moore's Jewel of Joyery.
Mm,
And in fact, as I recall, there was an introduction to the copy of Sword Woman that I had, which collected all of the Dark Agnes stories, where they recommended Jewel of Joyery, but they
nice.
said it was very different. And Jewel of Joyery is, of course, probably best known as being the protagonist of Dark God's Kiss.
Oh, Black
And
God's Kiss,
that
yeah, yeah.
is a total crossover between horror and fantasy, horror and sword and sorcery.
Yeah, I
Um,
always think of Gerald Jury. I think of her as kind of Alice in Wonderland with like a big sword,
yeah,
because she's always in all but one of her stories, and arguably even that one exception, which is a bit more gothic. Very quickly, she finds herself in another world. She's ostensibly 14th century French
that's right.
warlord lady,
Yeah.
but we never really see her doing that. We see her
No.
just going whoop and falling into a realm underneath the castle that happens to be a gateway to hell. Awesome.
Yep.
Or chasing after a wizard, through a portal, and then whoop, we're in the weird wizard realm immediately. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And pretty much always it's like, something wants to marry you, it's probably the devil. And she's like, no, I am the Lady of Joyery, I must get back to my castle. It's there's just, it's like there's there's a grim fairy tales aspect to it. There's a grimdark historical aspect to it. People are always getting killed. People are always, besieging castles and, conducting some kind of war. They're mercenaries, they're pirates. Oh, God, Bellet.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, speaking of a character who got one story, but people have wanted more of her ever since, and there's been comic miniseries and, of course, fan fiction.
Those comics are amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I read the first few and really enjoyed them.
Oh, they're incredible. And there's just like something so so gorgeous about, this fearsome fearsome Jewish pirate girl, who's just like, I really love killing people.
Well, and getting to see her get more adventures, right?
Exactly.
Because she basically dies to serve Conan's narrative in that story, and like, fine, once in a while that's going to happen. But
yeah, and
it was nice to see her get
and to
more.
be frank, also she dies to serve the narrative that if you get a Shemite lady and a bunch of jewels in the same
Yeah.
in the same vicinity, then it's like suddenly.
Yeah. Well, honk honk, it was written in the 30s.
Honk,
but
honk, indeed.
that's why
Honk,
it's
honk,
nice
indeed. But again, it's like there are plenty of people who certainly would not be like, I'm going to use a character who is overtly Jewish, but also make her sexy and amazing, and the love of Conan's life.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is the thing about, going back to the classic stuff, like Howard, like if it was just a collection of old attitudes, we wouldn't still be talking about
Yeah,
them.
exactly.
There's a lot of really cool stuff going on there.
Yeah. Jessica Amanda Salmonson's Amazons. Yes. Yeah. I read that fairly early on as well, which got me into God, who's the guy? The guy who did the DeSoye
Charles
stories?
Saunders.
Yes, Charles Saunders. Yeah, and that was the first time that I ever read about the Amazons of Dahomey. And
like Sword and Soul, some stuff rooted in African cultures instead of medieval.
Yeah, and one of the things that I absolutely loved about Simonson was that she was looking specific. Oh shit! And of course, she of whom we do not speak anymore.
Oh yes, well, yeah, Marion Zimmer Bradley. I fell into a free box of Sword and Sorceress collections, and I was like, well, I've given $0 to anybody.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of neat names in here. Mercedes Lackey, got a big boost out of that, for example. And it's been interesting going through that. And Saunders is in there as well, as you mentioned. So, at this point, well, sure. But yes,
well,
I know
this is the thing. I mean, you begin with stuff that spins off of like medieval France, medieval wherever. It spins off of, the Conan the Barbarian model. But pretty quickly, even in Conan, he's sort of like, and then I went here and fought, and then I went here and fought, and then I went here and fought. And every time Howard is like bringing in cultures that he finds cool. Pretty soon you're in Mongolia, pretty soon you're in Persia, pretty soon
you're in Iran, I mean Turan. You're in,
exactly.
So on, right? Like all these analogs.
And and that was the other thing that I found with Simonson and even with Bradley, that there were lashings of other cultures. There were, it's like, let's take this sort of vague model and stick it in a bunch of different places. And actually, as I recall, it was in a Sword and Sorceress that I ran across. God, was it Tears of the Moon? Which was one of the first openly queer or queer-ish sword and sorcery stories that I ever came across.
Oh, interesting. I haven't found that one yet because I got a whole box I'm still working through. But Tears of the Moon.
Scar on the Moon. It was the Scar on the Moon.
The Scar on the Moon.
Yeah. Okay. Where the the questing hero is female, and the person she's up against is a bisexual evil king who has like a boyfriend kneeling at his feet when he first meets her, and he's sort of attracted to her because he thinks she's a guy, and then he's still attracted to her when he figures out she's not a guy. And it was like, oh, catnip. It's like, give me more.
Awesome. Jeez.
So yeah, my liking has always been for stuff like that. So of course, House of the Dragon is totally my meat because, Targaryens and Starks, the two barbarian bunches of Westeros, and the two groups of people who are most allied with magic as well, and most allied with their animal sigils. They're just fucked up people who make fucked up decisions because they want
the best people to watch.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I'm going to marry my niece.
This will have no problems.
That's normal. Yeah. That's normal. That's totally normal. What is wrong with you?
Well, and speaking of the Targaryens and tying the past and the present and potential futures all together, you've read Moorcock and you mentioned Coram, but I'm guessing you've at least dabbled in Elric. And so looking at Matt Smith in his full armor, looking as he does in House of the Dragon, oh boy, do you feel like Moorcock should be getting a royalty check or something for the Elric of it all. And the Targaryens in general kind of make you think of the Melnibonéans with their,
yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, decadence, right? Decadence.
Yes.
From an early age, I've been very into decadent art. And, always running across stuff and going, oh, that's interesting. And then it would inevitably turn out to have been, painted around the turn of the 20th century.
So forgive me if I'm putting my foot in my mouth and I've missed something in your bibliography, but have you done much in the way before? As you're very much a horror veteran, how much, or if at all, have you dabbled in writing sword and sorcery before now?
I really haven't dabbled a lot in writing in sword and sorcery. I would say that, in a weird way, my Hexslinger stuff is kind of akin to sword and sorcery because Westerns are kind of akin to sword and sorcery in a weird way,
some people, yeah. I mean, Howard, a lot of frontier justice kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're roaming, you're moving from place to place. You're
the horizon between civilization and not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, between the fall of a civilization and the rise of a civilization. It's not that being a gunslinger is not that different from being a mercenary. And really, mercenaries and questers are like the two backbones of sword and sorcery narrative. And I did 4 pirate stories, which again are somewhat like sword and sorcery. But actually, I think the thing that I've done that's closest to sword and sorcery, very few people would have come across. My friends and I made up a shared world called Naruk, which was undergoing a huge revolution. Naruk is like full of people who are pantheists of one type or another. And then there is a huge uniting church that tries to occupy the continent and get rid of everybody else's gods. And so, of course, you get many different types of people uniting against them. And I made up a city, sort of city-state run by dark magic, and creepy and weird and full of cannibalism and strange shit. And wrote about four stories that took place in that. I'm negotiating right now to collect those in a collection and probably write at least one novella to try and bring, like Tanith Lee, the early stuff that I wrote was mainly linked short stories.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the point would be to write a novella that would bring that set of linked short stories, and there's about 4 of them, to a conclusion.
Okay, and yeah, kind of connect things. I bet. I mean,
Yeah,
to me, from a publishing side, that is very sword and sorcery because I think of how, other people came in later and did it with Howard's work because he died at 30.
yep.
But then I think of, say, Fritz Leiber and Moorcock both at
Oh,
points in
yeah.
their career would go, I wasn't planning a big grand continuity, but now I'm thinking I'd like one, so I'm gonna try and
Yeah,
do stitch ups, right?
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, no,
And
and it's a very appealing thing. Like I not to talk about me, but I'm writing a novel right now, which is I'm pretending I've had a long career and I'm now doing a stitch up. It's going to be like 17 short stories, and there is a kind of linear chronology, but I'm trying to write it so you can be airdropped into any one story as if you just picked up that week's magazine or
I
whatever.
love that model. I
Yeah.
absolutely love that model. And there's and that is in a lot of ways the Weird Tales model.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, um, it's like, oh, Howard Lovecraft. I really liked that story. Can you write me something else that's kind of like that? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And sometimes when an editor says that, you get Elric because that's where he came from, right? It was an
Yeah,
editor that came
exactly.
to Moorcock and was like, "Can you give me some Conan stuff?" And Moorcock was like, "I don't know. Maybe I'll turn him completely inside out and make him albino and decadent and civilized and dependent on drugs." And then, well, the rest is history.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
so yeah, yeah. Would you say that the sort of short and episodic nature of sword and sorcery is part of why it appeals to you?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that, in fact. And the way that you can build a person across many different points in their life, and
Mhm.
to some degree, I mean, it's sort of like a TV series, isn't it? It's like, you have movement, but it's not the type of intense forward movement that you get in a novel or a movie.
Yeah.
You know, even if you have, like, I don't know, a trilogy of movies or a trilogy of books, it's intense forward movement, and this is more like meandering forward movement.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, here's a bottle episode, here's a bottle
Yeah, it,
story,
it feel- it feels like parting
here's
of the
a
veils, getting a
yeah,
glimpse of this point, and then closing the veil and moving elsewhere, maybe,
yeah,
rather than, as you
exactly,
say, just like keeping the curtains open the whole time, and just like, okay, we're gonna go from birth to death.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, no, and there's always this sense with sword and sorcery and with linked stories generally that the character continues to exist out there in the world.
yeah,
We know, we have like a sketch of Conan's life, that he began as a thief and a reaver and a mercenary, and wandered all over the place, and then eventually he ends up as a king and a
yeah.
conqueror.
And just
But
even like, well, these are the stories perhaps he's telling as an old king of his version of how things went for him, which I
exactly,
love. Yeah, I love that idea. It's just he's like, yeah, no, I killed like 10 guys with my pinky finger. It was
that's
awesome.
right.
And
Yeah,
like
yeah,
all
they
the
were
torture.
civilized people, and naturally, I had no idea what they were talking about,
Yeah.
so I had to kill some people to get away.
Yeah, like, and all his courtiers are just like, "Yes, yes." But you killed 10 guys with your pinky finger. And if I can sort of wrench it right back around to horror for a second,
Absolutely.
I think the appeal of the storytelling model you and I are talking about with like dropping in and out of points in a character's life is because it leaves more unspoken than what is spoken, leaving room for our imaginations to add a greater sense of wonder. And isn't that what we want? Don't we want fantasy to be fantastic? And similarly, horror.
Yes.
You tell me what's scarier, Gemma. Is it scarier to catch a silhouette and have an idea that something's going to eat you, or is it more interesting to read a textbook about the monster and know that if you touch its left kneecap at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, it dies. So you just have to hold out till 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. You know?
Yeah, no, it's always, the idea of, the lacuna,
Yeah.
the idea of what's not shown, is always more interesting to me than what's absolutely shown. And, part of, when I first when I was a really fairly little kid, the first thing that I was really into was history and archaeology and C.S. Lewis. But but what one of the things that I figured out that I liked about history and archaeology,
Mm.
was that there's a lot of places where people just stop and they're like, okay, so we know this. We think maybe this might be true. We're not absolutely sure because there's a whole bunch of stuff missing here.
Yeah.
Between here and here, who are the Hyksos? It's like we're the
or the real life Sumerians. I believe there's a lot of questions about them.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of questions about most things.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of this makes sense to me. It's almost like poetry or mythology, indeed. Because that was another thing that I was very into. The Dolaires, Norse gods, Norse gods and giants, and the Greek gods books by the Dolaires. And what are the stories that we tell ourselves, and what are we sketching with those stories?
Well, and I'm curious about your take on like, I feel one of the really interesting tensions for me with sword and sorcery is, like, sometimes people will say the difference between a sword and sorcery story and a horror story is like, especially let's say a old Lovecraftian horror story, which would be sort of contemporary to the classic stuff. In Lovecraft, you tend to go gibbering mad, get eaten, or whatever.
Yeah.
Conan would face something comparable, and though he would be afraid because he didn't fully understand it, he would press forward nonetheless and try and survive and fight back even.
Yeah, absolutely. Or
so,
yeah, I mean, think about the God in the Bowl, right? If a Lovecraftian hero found literally a god in a bowl, he would look at the god and go insane, and the bowl would just sit there. And Conan, on the other hand, grabs the god in the bowl and cuts its head off, and and then goes, "Wow, I guess I was a god." It's pretty fucked up.
I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head. I'm sure somebody maybe watching could tell us in the chat, but I believe there was a round robin or whatever you call it, where one author writes a page and then passes on to the next author.
Yes.
And Lovecraft and Howard took part in one of those. And
Yes.
Lovecraft came before Howard. He wrote something where it was like the protagonist winds up on a world of big, weird, freaky bugs, and he gets turned into one.
Yes.
Oh no, what are you going to do?
And then Howard writes him taking over the world of freaky bugs.
Yeah. You see like a freaky bug with like a
world
cutlass.
Of freaky bugs.
Oh, and Kevin is helping us out in the chat here. The Challenge from Beyond. Yes.
Yes.
What that was
the
called.
Challenge from Beyond.
I've seen art for that. I just love the art of this big sort of putrid fly person, but holding a cutlass, like, just like
yeah, absolutely. And and again, there's something that's really pleasant about the and later when I stumbled across wuxia movies from Hong Kong, this was another thing that appealed to me. It's like these things can end happily or they can end unhappily. To be frank, they often end unhappily or weirdly tragically or like crazily tragically. But even in a world which involves elaborate politics that you don't really understand, and strange machinations, and the idea is that you can potentially cut yourself free of it, literally. You can potentially
just not every time. There's at least a couple of Conan stories, including Tower of the Elephant, where by the end of it, Conan's just kind of like, huh. That's the no
like,
ending.
oh well, okay.
That was messed up.
So that was a guy with an elephant head from another dimension.
Yeah, the universe is bigger than I realized.
Yeah, the universe is huge. Well, my brain is small, so I'm just gonna not think about that.
and so I think there's this tension.
I am a landless man.
There is I think an interesting tension for exploring, not only in the story itself, but looking at the writing craft side. I'd love to get your 10 cents on where.
Go on.
Okay, so horror very much works better the less you know, the more we can suggest and get the reader to do the work almost for you, so to speak. That sounds like I'm saying horror authors are lazy. I'm not. No, but not even close. But and then Sword and Sorcery, which has this sort of horror half genus or whatever going on, is also half action, proactive. Get in there, see what's going on. What's happening. My hand is hitting this thing, whatever. And so, writing it, I have found in my limited experience, I'm curious to hear how you feel about it. it's like a constant gut check situation where you have to say to yourself, well, I want to show enough like pushing forward, lunging forward into the light with the sword, doing the thing, the action,
Hmm.
the proactive. But if I go too hard with that, I'm going to make the mysterious, weird, unknowable sorcery side of it less interesting.
Yes.
So, but if I go too hard the other way, I'm going to make my protagonist not proactive enough, and then it'll be kind of closer to a straight horror story, or just like people kind of complain that your hero's not doing much. So, like,
Well,
how do you
I
navigate
think
that?
it helps to have like um more than one person in the story to have, I mean, think about the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser,
Yeah.
idea from Fritz Lieber, to have two people who are close enough to have an affinity to each other, but different enough to be able to argue with each other and to suggest things that the other person might not think about.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a model. There's a model of two people who came to kick each other's asses, and then something else comes out of the shadows, and they're like, "Okay, for now,
Yeah.
we're going
Yeah.
to unite and kick the ass of this other thing," you know, or just try to get out of here so that later we can kick each other's asses. you know, there's something that's very effective and attractive about that model. I'm not saying that's where I'm going with the
Oh.
story that I'm roughing out right now, but it's certainly something that that I've come across on many occasions and really enjoyed.
Mm.
And even the idea inherent in sword and sorcery that often you have a partnership or an antagonistship
Mm.
between a person who is mainly sword and a person who is mainly sorcery.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. You mentioned Tanith Lee earlier. I have to
Yes.
say, I've been doing my best to get caught up on the classics these last few years. I've been taking advantage of the Merrill Collection in Toronto. For those who don't know, it's the Western Hemisphere's largest speculative fiction archive that is publicly available. You just need a library card. And so that's how I've been able to read all kinds of out of print stuff and so on
Hmm.
and so forth. But despite intense study, etc., I have not yet actually scraped the surface of Tanith Lee, and
Okay,
yet have
this
heard
the thing that
fantastic
I would
things.
suggest for you
Yeah.
in terms of sword and sorcery with the stuff that she wrote a series of stories, linked stories, involving one character called Syrian. And Syrian,
Oh yes,
Cyrion,
yes.
is an interesting character because he is he definitely is like he's in that private eye mode, private eye with a sword kind of mode, where he's going from place to place and people will be like, "Oh, Syrian, I have this problem. Can you help me with it?" But he's very antithetical to the Conan mold because he's, kind of, blonde and pretty and a bit effeminate and very analytical
Mm.
and very much I would say like a Lyman character before Lyman,
Okay.
Dorothy Dunnett's Lyman books, or better yet, almost a Percy Blakeney character from the Scarlet Pimpernel. Like a guy who's kind of making himself look dumber than he actually is, and more venial than he actually is, and
Mm.
more. It's like, oh, a charming,
Get people's guard down, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And then suddenly you're like, oh, all right. It's like, no, this dude, this dude has a lot going on, and and is steelier and more vicious than you expect him to be
Mm.
in the crux of things. But yeah, I think you would. I think you'd probably enjoy those.
Okay, thank you, yeah,
That's a good place to start,
and anybody
particularly.
watching who doesn't know Tanith because I think she's getting reprinted a bit lately, but
Mm.
I do from
A
everything
lot
I've
of
heard, it
what's
sounds like
being imprinted is the Tales of the Flat Earth,
mm,
Knight's Master, Death's Master, Delirium's Master, Delirium's Mistress, and those are wonderful books, but they are more in the mold of, I'd say, the Thousand and One Nights,
mm,
and the main characters tend to be, gods. And they err on the sorcery side of things. But yeah, there's they're super queer and super odd, super weird. It's like the weird is definitely strong with those stories. I would also suggest that you read those.
Well, I'm into the weird. I mean, I've not gone as deep as I'd like yet,
Yeah.
but I have really enjoyed what I've enjoyed.
Knight's Master is pretty great, and Death's Master is also really wonderful. I would, I'd recommend almost everything that she's written.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, we're
It's
getting
coffee.
Oh, okay.
my husband giving me coffee.
Oh, well, very nice. Yeah, I was gonna say I haven't read as much as I'd like yet, but I've really enjoyed what I've read so far of, say, Clark Ashton Smith, who is also very much not the Conan model, and I think that kind of
Oh no, yeah,
no.
his stuff is like super decadent and super strange.
Yeah, and tends to the story I think most of from what I've read is the Dark Eidolon, where that young wizard gets stepped on by a rich guy's horse and is like, "Well, I'm dedicating the rest of my life to becoming an incredibly powerful necromancer, and I'm going to ensure you have a horrific, ironic death, and it's going to be the worst."
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Or Island of the Necromancers, or Island of the Torturers, even better.
Which gets a reference in Dark Eidolon, actually. But so there you go, the love of the shared universe within your stories, whether or not you're necessarily planning it.
Yeah, where everything is just like, oh, don't go over there. Fuck. Yeah, definitely don't go over there either. It's like he's very into worms growing out of tombs, and my girlfriend is a vampire, stuff like that. But just
relatable everyday problems.
Strange, so strange.
Right, but what's fun is with him, like I feel like he is so different from the text of the Conan stuff.
Oh,
But
fuck yeah.
still, if you think about it for a minute, you kind of go like, actually, all the elements are here. It's just being portrayed. Some of them are like the levels are up here and some of them are down as opposed to over here. I feel like sword and sorcery is an incredibly flexible genre.
It is, and people think of it as not being flexible, but it is actually infinitely flexible. Which, in that way, makes it very much like horror, because, I always say that whenever people say, I remember one time I was at a Canlit kind of festival, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, you're Gemma Files. You write horror, right?" And I said, "Yes." And they got this really weird look on their face and went, "Why?" I was like, "What do you write? Why?"
And did they explain that question?
No,
was it
not
because
at
they
all.
thought horror was very limited?
As far as I can tell, it's the usual thing where it's like horror. Oh, horror! It's the intersection of gore and porno streets, right?
Yeah,
that's what horror, like Hostel, right? Or horror like Friday the 13th, right? Which is fine. That's okay. It's like, Jesus Christ, Stephen Graham Jones is kind of writing, slasher fiction, but he's turning it inside out and he's tweaking it and he's doing all sorts of really fascinating stuff with it.
And he's even got a sword and sorcery story coming out in an anthology, by the way.
Nice. I would totally read that. I mean, I love the fact that Laird Barron is like a total sword and sorcery guy. Weird. I mean, we're all weird fiction people, but
But I think there's he's just for the proof that there's a lot of potential, and I think it's starting to get tapped into. I mean, we're gonna do it hopefully, but also him and Haley Piper both have horror stories in an anthology whose name has escaped me because I'm tired and dumb. But it's happening, man. And like, if you Google something you might enjoy after we stop this, and listeners, readers, watchers, whoever you are, may also enjoy. He did a great essay on his growing up on Conan and what it meant to him.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of he gets it.
A lot of us have this overlap of, loving private eye kind of mystery stories, loving noir, loving hard-boiled stuff, loving metal, loving metal music, which has like a huge subgenre of sword and sorcery type metal, you know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm a big baby. I don't listen to metal, but I am well aware of the huge overlap. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
you know,
And in the art, even right. There's a
yeah,
lot of like metal artists from like the
exactly. You know,
'70s with sword sorcery covers that art that just got reused as their like van
naked
art or
ladies
cover art.
covered in swords. It's covered in golden jewels with swords, you know, like
Exactly. Exactly.
and a skull in your crotch. You know, it's like
Best place for a skull, I guess. But
I used to do this thing on back when I was on Tumblr a lot more than I am now. I do still have a Tumblr, but I just don't do much
it's a
with
bit
it.
quieter there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I would find very sword and sorcery kind of art and post it, and underneath I would put the hashtag um, occupation evil queen.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think it goes back to that. I think it goes back to, you know, I want my occupation to be evil queen, you know.
Well, I nearly made a dress for the job you want joke, but I'm not. That sounds like a weird
Yeah.
suggestion. But yeah. So okay, so we're as we're chunking along here, we've talked a lot about the history of sword and sorcery and
Yeah.
its overlap with horror. I'm curious, you know, I'm sure you've spent a few minutes thinking about the possible stories that can be told in the realm of horror, and I'm guessing you've also had those thoughts maybe about sword and sorcery, especially if you're having them right now, looking at
Hmm.
writing a story.
Yes.
What Newish Sword and Sorcery, a big part of its whole remit is not just, although this is a very big part of it, making the genre sort of broader and friendlier and more inclusive to people outside of, frankly, my own personal demo.
Hmm.
But also trying to experiment with how far you can push those sort of boundaries while still keeping the genre recognizable, which I would say is quite far.
Yeah.
Is there anything, after having read all that lovely stuff that we've been talking about for the last while, is there anything that you would really love to see more of or see at all? Maybe you haven't seen it before in Sword and Sorcery
Mm.
and the horror
Um,
intersection of it?
a lot of people think of sword and sorcery as a kind of Dungeons and Dragons type
Mm.
model, and I am interested in the same way that I was interested during the very brief period where I actually played Dungeons and Dragons,
Nice.
in doing what I do with everything, which is to make my party up entirely of villains and monsters. You know, villains, anti-heroes, and monsters. People who are not trustworthy, and people who are not, and people who are, not um, recognizably, necessarily human.
Have you
People
ever
who have
read
stuff
before I lose
going
it
on.
before I lose it, have you ever
Yeah.
read Jack Vance's Dying Earth novels, in particular the stories with Kugel the Clever?
No, actually, I haven't.
Well, you might enjoy books 2 and 3 of the 4 book series are all centered on this roguish guy named Hugel, and he's a villain who's forced
Mm.
into adventuring circumstances and might be right up your alley. Anyway, please continue. Just I didn't want to lose that thought.
Anyway, so I mean, some of the things that I'm messing around with. For example, recently I saw the movie Medieval, which is about Jan Žižka, basically. It's like young Jan Žižka, and one of the who, if you don't
I've
know,
never
was
there.
like uh, the big general of the Hussite Wars.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the Hussite Wars broke out because Jan Hus, who was one of the even before Luther, was one of the sort of proto-Protestant thinkers of Bohemia. Was burned alive. It was one of those things where he was excommunicated twice for basically saying, no, people should be allowed to make up their own minds about God and what God wants, and people should be allowed to read the Bible and shit. It's like you don't necessarily need priests to as
Interpret.
intermediaries between you and God. And yeah, he was excommunicated twice, left Bohemia, and then stupidly came back and then was arrested and burned alive. And so when Jan Žižka, who was a mercenary and a soldier, heard about this, he was like, "Son of a bitch must pay," and and got together an army which was largely composed of peasants, using things like flails and other, and scythes and whatever they had, and basically started attacking the current king of Bohemia, who was also the king of Hungary, and the Roman emperor at the time, the Holy Roman Emperor, and fought off a huge army of Teutonic knights at one point. Lost both his eyes, and even when he was blind, was still such a good strategist that he never lost a battle.
Jesus.
So
that's a compelling character. So
yeah.
So you watched the movie Medieval.
So I watched the movie Medieval, and I was like, I would like to have a character who actually believes in something, but something that you would not expect them to believe in. So I'm interested in that. Almost like a oh god, that character that Howard did,
Solomon
the Puritan.
Kane?
Solomon Kane. Almost like Solomon
the Puritan,
Kane.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like a 13th century Solomon Kane. I kind of love that idea.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, I'm certainly intrigued to
Yeah, well,
see.
it helped he was being played by Ben Foster, who is, of course,
okay.
the model for Chess Pargeter in the Hexlinger series. I just kind of like, a weird little porcupine of a guy who you don't expect to be kicking ass all over the place.
Well, and the belief system thing, I think that's very interesting to sort of
Yeah.
wrestle with. I mean, a lot of fans of Solomon Kane will say that they enjoy him,
Yeah.
but understand that if he hadn't had his belief system, he just would have been a psychopath.
Yeah.
It's like
Basically, yeah. No, he's a total psychopath.
So there's the belief system, the justification, a way of that character being like, well, I know what I am, but I gotta filter this through something.
Yes.
Or does the belief system drive one to become more so that way? That could be a way. That can be a fun thing, I think, to explore.
Yeah, exactly. So so one of the characters is going to be this young Jan Žižka kind of person, and then I have two other characters, one of whom is a lich on a lich horse, and the other one is a necromancer who keeps bringing him back to life. Female necromancer with no nose who keeps bringing him back to life. And sort of like at the too legit to quit. It's like, like at the end of the battle, the owl will always be dead, and then the noseless one will bring him back to life. Yeah. And
Cool.
And in the middle, probably, I don't know, a Viking warrior, who's just there to basically be like, well, this is all very weird, very, very strange and disturbing.
I love it. Okay, so we've been talking for a while now. Why don't we? Are there perhaps there won't be any, but are there any questions from the chat for Gemma and I to discuss? The chat is quiet. Okay, well, fair enough.
No.
Well.
Kevin can just keep raving about.
Yeah, Kevin, tell us we're both very handsome. Just shower us with compliments. That's question enough.
Yeah, amazing.
Oh, well, Kevin does have a horror question. All right,
okay, cool.
Kevin, lay it on us. Let's see if you can do that StreamYard thing where it like bumps up on the screen. But if you can't, that's cool.
Okay. So what's the question?
Imagine that there is some like nice on hold music playing while like Kevin is typing. Okay, Kevin asks, hey, there we go. We got it on screen. Your novel experimental film is part of the subgenre of horror stories about imaginary movies. Do you have any other favorites from that subgenre?
Oh yeah. Yes, there are a bunch of different stories that people have been doing fairly recently about most recently, there's an entire anthology of found footage horror stories, which is incredible. But yeah, there's Sylvia Moreno Garcia did a short story long before she, had her breakout hit with Mexican Gothic, which involved a movie, a movie that was sort of part of the King in Yellow mythology, and I think it might have been called Yellow, actually. And that was pretty amazing. There's Flicker, which is an entire novel about subliminal, about a bunch of Cathars putting subliminal splices in B movies, and trying to convince people that the world is a trick and a trap and they should stop having sex. And just drive humanity into the ground. That's really great. John Langan did an incredible one about a it's called like Dark Nights, I think. It's an anthology edited by Ellen Datlow, strangely enough, and it's called Something Like Dark Nights, Something Nights. And the story that John Langan has in that is called Lost in the Dark, and it's about a guy it's told from the point of view of a guy who is checking out, interviewing the woman who made a found footage movie called Lost in the Dark, and the sort of the background of how she made the movie and where the movie was made and what the real life story that the movie is playing off of was, and all of that is incredible. Oh my God, there's another one that I absolutely love, done fairly recently, which involves Riot Girl magazines and Super 8 experimental film, which was written, I think, about 3 years after experimental film came out. Damn it. I did not expect to be asked that question. I did not expect to be asked this particular question.
Kevin, how dare you?
But yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff. I mean, Night Film, Marisha Pessel, same thing. But yeah, definitely check out Lost in the Dark by John Langan, because that's a thing and a half.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. And I'm sure that from what you told us, we can Google the other one. But I'll tell you, Riot Girl magazines and Super 8 film.
Yeah, I know. And I can't fucking remember who wrote it or who. Curtis Lawson? Could have been Curtis Lawson. Oh. Anyways, I'm sorry.
That's all right. We got some search terms if people really want to dig that one up. I certainly do. Yeah. We'll go hunting for it. And the recording of this will be up afterward. If I can find out what that book is, I will put it in a comment underneath the video.
Please do.
All right. Well, it's been about an hour now.
I just didn't expect to be asked about film books.
No, it's all good.
Film horror. Actually, this story that I just wrote is also film horror.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Do you know what home that story will be having? Is it an upcoming anthology, or is it something you're
it's coming out in an upcoming anthology of postmodern horror. So should be interesting.
All right, we'll keep an eye out for that. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Gemma. This has been really lovely.
All right.
And I especially appreciate it because I know you're on some deadlines. So let's get you back to that.
Okay. Thank you.
Get back to work.
All right, man. Always.
Yeah,
24/7.
And I'll finally, of course, close by reminding everybody, we are here to promote a Kickstarter, folks. So please, if you want to read Gemma's Sword and Sorcery story for New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine, well, like I said, I haven't looked because I've been doing this interview in the last hour, but we were at 73%, just a couple $100 shy of 75. Get on in there. It wraps up at 8 a.m. on Saturday, March 4th. But be kind to me. Get us funded before the Friday night so I can sleep going into that Saturday morning. I would just, as a personal favor to me, I'd appreciate it. All right. Thanks so much for your time, Gemma. Bye.
Bye-bye.